My name is Cristina Basescu, and I will talk today about network nodes that hinder communication in the internet and how we can localize them. And I will present Faultprints, the first full localization protocol that scales to inter-domain settings. This is joint work with Yushun Lin, Homing Zhang, and Adrian Perig. So when a source contacts a destination over the internet, it expects the network to be available. And this is vital, especially in the case of critical infrastructures. However, there are many things that can go wrong. Well, last December, unauthorized code was discovered on Juniper routers that may have been used to spy on Juniper customers. Now, if this attack results in traffic delay, perhaps we can localize it. Also, ISPs engage in anti-competitive behavior with the purpose of increasing their revenue. And oftentimes, they drop or delay packets. And so it would be nice to know where this happens. So there are countries that censor communication. For instance, Myanmar and the United Arab Emirates drop Skype packets. And finally, the network may not be available because of misconfiguration. And as you can see in the figure, this happens quite often. And so our goal is to localize entities that drop, delay, or modify traffic. And so if the source can localize such entities, whether there are those nodes there with a question mark, it could select a path that goes around these nodes, like the green path in the figure. And so there are 4 questions that a full localization approach should ask and should answer. The first one is, who localizes faults? Is it the source? Are there perhaps other nodes in the network that localize them? Second is, how long does it take to localize nodes, to localize faults? And what is the communication overhead? And finally, what is the storage strain on nodes? I mean, these nodes that support full localization, how much do they need to store? And so there has already been extensive work in full localization. And previous approach do a wonderful work in localizing faults inside a domain. So they are intra-domain approaches. But when we look at inter-domain settings, so across domains, we see that they are not practical. And let me show you why. Well, typically, to localize faults, nodes store summaries of the traffic that they observe. And in some of the approaches, for instance, you see here neighboring nodes, so they store summaries of the outgoing and incoming flows. And then they compare their views of the world. And they can use either trusted hardware, or they can send these summaries to a trusted central entity. But in large-scale networks, relying on a trusted central entity or requiring everybody to deploy trusted hardware is cumbersome. On the positive side, these approaches require low storage overhead. It's only per neighbor state. In other approaches, all nodes on the path need to store summaries of the packets that they observe. And then they send these summaries back to the source. But as we will see, they require either per flow or per source state. And in fact, you can see in this table, in the first 2 columns, they require up to a couple of gigabytes and then up to hundreds of gigabytes. And this is on the fast path. And so this is not exactly practical. And I will present you Faultprints. This is our approach that only requires less than 50 megabytes of storage. So how do we do that? Well, in Faultprints, nodes probabilistically sample the packets that they observe. So nodes do not store information about all packets. And then sampling is based on keys that are shared between each node and the source. But recall that we don't want per source storage. So instead of storing these keys, nodes derive them on the fly. And for this, we use the DRKey protocol that was published at SICOM 2 years ago. And so because the source has these keys, it knows which nodes should sample which packets. But nodes do not know about each other's behavior because they do not have each other's shared keys. And so the source can then compare the expected behavior with the actual runtime behavior and can localize where something doesn't match. So each node, for storing these packet fingerprints, each node has a Bloom filter. And if we look at the green node that shares the green keys with the source, when the source sends a packet, it inserts an authenticator. And this authenticator is updated by each node on the path, depending on the contents of the packet. So the authenticator captures both the packet presence and the packet contents. And so when a packet reaches this node, the node first updates the authenticator based on the packet contents and the previous authenticator. So it's a nested authenticator. And then it randomizes the sampling decision based on this field. If the output is greater than the sampling probability, it's going to store it in the Bloom filter. Now you may notice that if we actually do the steps that I mentioned here, the nested authenticator is computed on the whole packet. And this slows down processing. So instead, an optimization that we do is we let the source pre-compute some digests of the packet contents for each node on the path. Then the nodes first just use their digest to see what the value of the authenticator. And only if the packet needs to be stored do they check whether the digests have the correct value. Now, this technique of letting the source compute digests also allows us to decrease communication overhead. You'll see later, when the source wants to retrieve the Bloom filter bits, it only needs to send these digests to let the source query their Bloom filters and not send the entire packet. I have described here packet modification, but we use similar techniques for packet drop and for localizing packet delay. So the source sees that something might have gone wrong because some of the packets are not acknowledged. And in fact, this can happen due to benign reasons. Link have a natural drop rate, and this might be perfectly legitimate. And so the source only proceeds to localize faults only when the end-to-end rate of unacknowledged packets exceeds the end-to-end natural drop rate. And for some of the unacknowledged packets, the source sends a probe request. And then each node replies with the Bloom filter bits. Now, probe replies travel the same unreliable network. So some of the nodes may not send probe replies at all because they want to hide misbehaving. And other nodes may modify these replies. And so they might arrive incorrectly at the source. And the source will localize faults based on both correct and incorrect probe replies. In the case of correct probe replies, the source computes link corruption scores. Such a score just gives us an idea of how many times a link appears to have misbehaved. And so a big gap between two neighboring links shows that there might be a problem there. For instance, if these are the received values on the first row, where a tick means that the packet was observed in the Bloom filter, an X that the packet was not stored, and a question mark is an incorrect reply, then the source will compare the expected values, which it knows, with the received values, and we'll see where was the last place where the packet was correctly observed, and where's the first place where the packet went missing. And so all these links appear to may have misbehaved. So, or their corruption scores go up. This step is repeated by the source multiple times. And so, because the source does this for multiple unacknowledged data packets, it will be able to localize with a higher precision where a fault occurs. The source also uses incorrect probe replies to assess a node misbehavior probability for each node. This means how probable is that node to have dropped or modified a probe reply. For details, please see the paper. Well, is our protocol secure? After all, we operate in an unreliable network. Well, I'll first explain how we defend against storage exhaustion attacks. Nodes store packet fingerprints for a limited amount of time. We divide time in epochs, and in fact, they store packets for an epoch at most. And in the worst case scenario, when the node receives traffic at line rate and the smallest size packet, we actually need to store less than 50 megabytes per 10 gigabits per second of traffic. And this is for a range of false positive rates of the Bloom filter that gives us a good accuracy, as you will see in the evaluation. I'll also explain how we defend against framing attacks, and the scenario is as follows. There is a malicious node that tries to behave in such a way to make the target node look as malicious. So what could the malicious node do? Well, first, it could selectively drop data packets or modify them, and it would choose those data packets that are likely to be sampled by the target node. Well, but the malicious node does not know which packets the target node would sample. So at best, it can just drop them at random. A more interesting case is when the malicious node drops replies that originate at the target node. So in this case, the malicious node would make it look like the target node does not send replies because it has something to hide. And for this, to defend against this attack, we make probe replies indistinguishable from each other. And you may know that indistinguishability is a hard problem, but in our setting, it's a little bit easier. That's because the source can tell each node when to send the reply. So we defend against timing attacks. And second, because each node can encrypt the probe reply. And so it's not possible based on contents to say where the reply originates. And so the best strategy for an attacker is to attack at random. And this reduces our attack surface. There are also other attacks that we consider in the paper, but I will skip them. Well, you've all just had lunch, but there is no such thing as a free lunch. And let's see some pros and cons of Faultprints. Well, I've said that we have low storage, but this comes at the cost of higher communication overhead. This compares to previous schemes. In fact, our scheme has about 3% communication overhead, and this is much higher than other schemes. However, bandwidth is less expensive than storage on the fast path. And this is why we make this trade-off. We also require paths to be symmetric or significantly overlapping. And for delay localization, we require time synchronization. This is also what previous schemes required. And as I said, we are secure against sophisticated attackers. And I will please refer to the paper or feel free to ask questions. Now let's see how Faultprints performs. Well, we first simulated scenarios to see how accurate the scheme is. And that's because it's a probabilistic scheme. And we have one malicious node at random locations on the path. And I will present here a path length of 5 ASs, which is the average path length in the internet. On the x-axis, you see the false positive rate of the Bloom filter. Higher values of the false positive rate means we have a lower storage, but there's a higher chance of collisions. And so the scheme is less precise. And on the y-axis, there is the localization accuracy, where higher is better. And you can see that as soon as the source sends 2,000 data packets, at least for 0.01 probability of 0.01 false positive rate of the Bloom filter, the scheme is more than 95% accurate. And actually, as soon as the source sends 4,000 data packets, we see that the scheme is, again, more than 95% accurate for all false positive rates that we have evaluated. Now, regarding throughput, we do not want to slow down existing traffic. And so here you can see data packets on the x-axis, the data packet size, and on the y-axis, the forwarding efficiency. And for small packets, you see that throughput is around 50 gigabits per second, and the goodput is around 15. But for large data packets, greater than 1,024 bytes, the throughput starts being line rate, and the goodput is around 90 gigabits is around 100 gigabits per second. Well, we've also looked at what happens when we send data packets whose size has the same distribution as the data packet size in the internet. And for such traffic mix, the throughput is almost line rate, and the goodput is around 95 gigabits per second. In conclusion, I have presented Faultprints, a full localization scheme that scales to the size of the internet. And that's because we use probabilistic packet sampling. We have low storage. And you've also seen that the throughput is close to line rate for an internet mix data packet distribution. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions.
Any questions?
Hi, just a clarification. So I saw that in your empirical evaluation you had one node randomly put somewhere on the path, is that correct?
Yeah, that's right.
So can Faultprints be used to find multiple faulty nodes
Yes,
on a path?
Yes, it can be used to find multiple faulty nodes.
Okay, you just haven't experimented with it?
Not where I showed it here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got it, thanks.
We have a little time for other
But perhaps I should clarify that it's going to detect them one by one. So it's not going to detect multiple faulty nodes at the same time. So you're first going to detect the one that misbehaves the most, let's say, and the one that's closer to the source. And then, if you have a path that's going to go around that node, you're going to detect the others. So this is how the scheme works.
So if all the nodes misbehave equally badly, then it always finds the closest one to the source.
Well, yeah, and you need to, you need to take it off the path, so not send traffic to that node to find the other ones. Yes.
Okay.
That's true.
Any other questions? Well, I have a question. How do you envision Faultprints can be deployed in practice?
Yeah, so this is a very good question. It's always it always comes up for new network protocols. So luckily in this case, we can deploy Faultprints in islands. So you can imagine that, let's say, if a few ASs around the internet deploy it, then the source could know on which segment between these ASs something bad may happen.